It's fine if you're more happy with it. Rather, it's fine. Who's the first to open up? Closing up. Closing up. Great. Okay, well, we're into the second round. As before, 7-minute speeches for the first and last minute protected. Any questions? Great, I'd like to call upon the first speaker to open the case for the government.
May I stand here?
Yeah. Well, no.
Okay, no, Sorry for delay, just to set up my stopwatch. Mr. Speakers, inflammatory rhetoric has been constantly used in primaries and yet never to actually go out into main elections because there are superdelegates who can actually choose as elite part of party who is going to be there. We believe it eternally damages the discourse that happens afterwards and how people feel about it. For example of this is Donald Trump, who was winning this because of this, polluting this discourse that damage a lot of people who live inside the United States of America. However, he's still not going to win because in the end he has delegates who choose not to support him over some other candidates like Ted Cruz who believe it's more moderate. In the end, he polluted that discourse and he creates some irreversible harms which will show you that are concretely connected with the primaries. Second problem we're trying to solve is the little vote and how little people can rearrange their voting and lobbying in order to actually influence the whole party in the end, fighting for their own end game rather than just after the primaries pass on not get what they want. Who are we going to choose to represent these people? We're going to choose the delegate, the vote of the leader, political leaders who stand behind them, and we believe they're good for one. Who are these specific stakeholders? They're superdelegates, they're whips of majority or minority inside these parties. They're distinguished members who their constant contribution to the political party gain their image, their presence in the political party, their respect, and they know who to choose in order to win this. They're most influential parts of the political elite, and we believe they're the ones who should we delegate this to. However, some severe attacks from the side of opposition can come and say that this is not cool because it doesn't represent people very much. First of all, Mr. Speaker, notice the turnout on these primaries is a bit low, which means in the end, because people know in the end they have to vote for the main one, to the big one, who's already been chosen by by the superdelegates. We believe this is why this doesn't represent the whole America per se. But we believe these people, stakeholders, have 4 levels of checks and balances before them in order to actually create a good vote for to represent people. First one is the checks and balances they do have as a whole Democratic Party when they stand up behind one candidate as a president. Thus, people support the specific candidate can later be spilled over to the support of the whole political party, and they know they have to make the best decision in order to explain to the people who they represent and what the Democratic or Republican Party really is. Second point is that the representation right now, as we already explained, is not as the highest because the turnout isn't as high. In a situation when you focus yourself solely as a real elections, that election comes over, more people will go to actually buy into this narrative, actually going on elections to vote for. Why, Mr. Speaker? Because they know they have one candidate from the start. The campaigns are going to change drastically because you will have one person who will talk about to the people overall, all nation, which means he'll be the one who's most likely to appeal to the vast majority of people to discuss these differences that can exist for example, in the state of Iowa. Hillary Clinton can specifically talk about her perception of that specific situation should be resolved. We believe this kind of direct representation and closeness to specifically one candidate who's representing you and his ability to tailor these policies directly on you should be really important, and she's the best comparatively best way in order to appeal to these specific issues. Thirdly is because you already right now do have those elites talking about, not yet for the questions, still we have choosing who to represent. For example, still vast amount of money has been spent by lobbies to actually support Jeb Bush in today's world. Still, superdelegates and elites said that Jeb Bush is not the person who should run for the presidency and turn their attention to Ted Cruz. What does it mean? You have already points of checks and balances of these elites over big lobbies, not to go overhaul everything, not to pollute the whole discourse inside political party. They know that their history, which is the fourth reason of them making a good decision, how and what principles Democratic or Republican Party stood for, they know what to represent and how to fight against them. Which means this is going to be a bit transparent because many people do know what to expect from Republican or Democratic Party, and they know they should pressure these delegates to choose that further on. Not yet, quite a bit. Now, second point of analysis is, what does it mean that polluting discourse does? Polluting discourse in primaries is specific because right now you have some waste amount of candidates who are fighting for their own piece of cake. In order to do that, you have to galvanize people around you. For the best way for today is to talk about some specific inflammatory rhetorics to appeal to those people. For example, you have Donald Trump who talks about creating America great again. This is what happens in the primaries, and this damages the discourse further on. Why? Because people who are from Middle East are damaged precisely because of this narrative that happens. They're hard today to go to the streets in some specific parts of town because they will be targeted by people who will use the same rhetorics because someone on the top used them. Second reason is the feel of primaries when you have constant these characters standing in front of from arena of people and talking about the specific issues with that specific inflammatory rhetorics. In the end, you're enhanced. You feel cathartic to leader to do that, to follow them. In the end, you internalize that message, and you're more likely to act upon that radical rhetorics on the streets because you have that mechanism of collective action. You see, connect directly people who support you and stand before you, and you're more prone to be radical to take it on the streets. You can go closing.
Your arguments are exclusively based on Donald Trump. How do ideological candidates like Bernie Sanders or Ron and Rand Paul pollute anything? They just contribute to a necessary ideological discussion.
Here is how they actually pollute, and that's the second argument, because their vote is wasted upon it. Even though Bernie Sanders has a big support right now, there is no statistic and there is no mechanism to show that he's going to beat Hillary Clinton because he represents the same issues. However, she has more money to actually go inside. When people spend, like small lobby parties who are representing education in the United States of America, spend their amount of money upon Bernie Sanders, in the end, when he loses, that money is lost because it's connected to the specific character per se. Alternatively, it's much better to actually invest in the whole Democratic Party to know that that Democratic top and elites do owe you something. In the meanwhile, you can still maintain your presence in the discourse through social medias, through gathering, through direct talks with that specific candidate. Imagine that you had more money as a lobby group to influence the whole Democratic Party, not more money, but the same amount of money that you influence the Democratic Party to support your educational policies. However, because now you know there is only one candidate, you come to a gathering of Hillary Clinton and confront her with that specific issues you do have. Overall comparative stands on our side. Vote government. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call on the first speaker of the opposition.
Dear panel, 3 points in my speech. Firstly, about the democratic rationale, why we do want primaries, why we do want to give more for representation, specifically to the people who vote for this party. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about why we're basically going to destroy the independence of people within the Senate and the Congress, usually harming the American democracy. Thirdly, I'm going to talk to you about more power to lobbyists, not the nice liberal lobbyists they want to talk about, but the main contributors of lobbying, meaning oil industries, the big firms, the banking industries, those things that actually hamper any attempt to make changes through the democratic process. Before that, a few quick points of rebuttal. Firstly, note their entire problem, basically, is people using bad rhetoric in primaries. They never explain to us Firstly, why you only get this bad rhetoric through primaries, meaning you get it through Fox News, you get it through debates in Congress, you get it through a great deal of other things which we very much doubt they want to exclude. So note that the additional harms caused specifically by primaries is not that significant and not actually explained. However, note that primaries are also a place for very important discourse, discourse in which people challenge the existing views. Now they tell us, but people never do that. Bernie Sanders will never get elected. I have two words for you. Barack Obama. Barack Obama was not someone that the leadership would want to select. He was deemed to be completely unelectable. However, through microfinancing, he got most of his money through microfinancing from the public. However, he is now president of the United States. We're saying this is the sort of things that you're not going to get under your side of the house, and this is critical. Thirdly, he tells us, but lobbies can now save money. Firstly, we think that the fact that lobbyists can manage their affairs in a more economic way is a very bad reason to stop primaries. If the primaries work as you say, these lobbies can save money up front. They can make their own decisions. This is not a reason for a ban. Secondly, we're saying again that these lobbies are small compared to the huge industrial lobbies that are actually going to benefit greatly from this. I'm going to explain that in my third point. Let's talk about democratic rationale, because basically we say the following thing. We don't know as a state what is good for society, because there is no objective definition of that. Because people can decide, for example, that one issue is more important to them, because people have contradictory issues, because basically people can vote on identity, people can care more about who their representative is on a personal level than who they actually vote for. Now note, they limit their own entire analysis to only the president. In the US, most of the decisions these people make, and this is part of the motion, is things like choosing your congressman, choosing your senator, choosing a person who actually represents you directly. We're saying in this sort of situations, it's especially important to be able to have different views and lots of these views, because we have basically two mechanisms or two considerations that we want to take into account when making political decisions. Because it's not an objective issue, because it basically relies on what people prefer and what most people prefer. So we want, firstly, the notion of just the amount of people who prefer certain policy. Obviously, this is decided much better when you have a lot more people who are able to come into the process, specifically the people who are the most relevant stakeholders for the specific party, the people who nominate, the people who identify themselves as Republican or Democrat and want their voice heard in this specific issue. Now, note, obviously, we accept that the leadership doesn't want to elect someone who's unelectable. They probably under their side of the house won't get someone we completely don't want. However, note firstly that the leadership has many biases in terms of first of all, them themselves being people privileged classes in society, people usually from historically privileged groups who have the power, who have the money, who have all sorts of things that the average American doesn't necessarily have and does not necessarily identify with. This is hugely important in terms of choosing people who come from minorities, choosing people who challenge the status quo. We're saying this is something that it's much less likely to happen under your side of the house. Moreover, the second issue that we need to take into consideration is the intensity of preferences. And here also we say that primaries are especially good tool in order to do that. They talk to us about lobbies, about the Tea Party or crazy organizations taking over. We're saying these organizations, if they care more about specific issues, it's good that they are able to organize to advance those specific issues, that they are able to organize in order to influence environmental policy through all candidates or to influence any other sort of policy. Now, please sit down. And so we're saying you get significantly less of that under your side of the house as well, the ability of people who have the most stake in the issue to actually come and voice their opinion. Now, just a second, note that obviously we have limiting mechanisms or balancing mechanisms through the entire public voting later. So we're not likely to get parties committing suicide by electing completely unelectable people like Donald Trump. However, we're saying that we're more able to bring it to consideration. We're more able to bring in more preferences and being able to reflect people's opinions and choices better. We're saying that's hugely influential. Moreover, even if they say that their mechanism is somehow as reflective as ours, note that they still take from people the feeling that they have a stake in the process. Note that under their side of the house, people don't feel that they are the ones who elected this man, that their congressman is someone they specifically chose and represents their party, that they have an ability to choose who their party's candidate for presidencies. As we say, that is hugely critical in the sense of people wanting to take part in the first place, which OG also talked about as an important thing in their side. Before I go on closing.
Do you think that France, ostensibly a two-party state, lacks internal party dialogue, and if so, should they adopt primaries?
Firstly, we're saying yes, primary is a good mechanism, we believe, for France as well. Secondly, it's not a two-party system. They have more than two parties, and let's explain now why the two-party issue is specifically important. Because in a two-party system, you have to assume a certain level of flexibility in the sense of how congressmen and senators actually vote. Because if they vote exactly by the whip, you actually get a changing dictatorship once every 2 years, because the whole party votes exactly on the same lines, and you know what those lines are to begin with. So every vote in Congress is rigged. Why is this critical? Where do people differ? They differ when the whip tells them to do one thing, and they know their constituents want something else, that they will not be elected by this. Now, under their side of the house, the whip is the one that elects you. The leadership of the party is the one that chooses who will be the representative. This is usually critical because now there is no chance of anybody going against the whip, against the party line. And we're saying this makes every decision in Congress rigged. This means that they have no reason to listen to public pressure during the time they're in office. They have no reason also they have much less of a reason for accountability within their own constituents. We're saying this is terrible in the sense of we're creating a more distant politics, a politics that doesn't reflect people, and a politics that is just significantly less democratic. We are proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I can call on the second speaker for the government.
Mr. Speaker, what effectively destroys any chance of effectively and actively collaborating within the Senate, within the Congress, is partisanship. What we say increases partisanship to a huge level are primaries. Now note, Mr. Speaker, that the voter turnout on primaries is abysmal, at least for the last 3 or 4 election cycles. That means that A, the democratic legitimacy is, well, questionable at best, and that means B, that they're a fertile ground for radical narratives. Now this is an abstract notion, so in concrete terms, that means that you have to be as extreme and as partisan as you can in order to get elected. Why? Because you have to motivate people to actually go out and vote. You have to persuade them that this is of vital importance. In order to persuade them, you have to fearmonger. You have to make them feel afraid. You have to actually portray the other side as a villain. Why is this relevant for the element of campaign financing? We say that when you do that, you need a lot of money for attack ads. It gets personal, right? So the only way in which you can get money, in which you can basically finance and funnel all these millions in these attack ads in order to basically destroy your opponent, in order to portray him as something less of a politician, something less even of a human, and try to basically portray them as a horrible human being, which actually happens in some of the states, unfortunately, you have to get money from super PACs, right? Super PACs are something that is constitutional. That means that you get a lot of people that support you for your inflammatory rhetorics. That means that you owe your allegiance later on to these people and not to the apex of your party. Now, here's the very important thing about this. We see that when you have this radical narrative, which basically gets incentivized by the low voter turnout, what you get in our society, in our status quo, is a situation where you have a government shutdown. Are situations which are akin to that. It doesn't have to necessarily happen and lead to a government shutdown, but it means that we cannot reach a consensus on major policy issues. Why can't we reach that consensus? Because we have to get re-elected in our constituency, right? Because we don't owe our allegiance to the political party leadership. That means that we have to continuously be aggressive towards the other side. That means that we have to continuously be radical towards the other side and vilify them as someone which we cannot possibly compromise. Concrete harms from this are quite intuitive and very realistic. That means that policies that we actually vote on are either completely abstract and whitewashed from anything, or more importantly, more important policies, even if they are useful for, are not being voted out in the Congress and in the Parliament, because we simply by default don't vote for Republican initiatives, or by default don't vote for Democratic initiatives because we belong to the other side and because we think we will sell this to our constituents very efficiently. Go.
Even if you're correct, having the occasional radical in Congress is preferable to only having obedient lackeys in
Excellent. Here's why this comparative is fundamentally untrue on your side in this debate. We see there are like several reasons as to why there's going to be still a Bernie Sanders, there's going to be still a Rand Paul, etc., etc. What we usually have, Mr. Speaker, is that these parties want to win elections in these states. So they do actually choose the most electable candidate, right? In Vermont, it's probably Bernie Sanders. There will still be important people like him in the political system, which we actually need to put forth in order to win elections. Now, they might actually ask, but what incentives does a new Bernie Sanders have to emerge? We say that if we have a certain ideological framework within a certain state, we have an active incentive to basically put this person forward, right? To put him in elections in order for him to get elected. And here's the thing, that person doesn't have to be the president. You can be Rand Paul or his father, Ron Paul, and be still active and very loud in the Senate, right? You can have disproportionate media attention while you are being active in the Senate and in the Congress, and therefore basically have all this attention in the first place. You don't need necessarily primaries in order to get media attention. Here's the thing, you don't necessarily need primaries, right, to advance these agendas. And here's why democracy within the political party will basically function very well. Because we have a two-party system, which we like, because it basically curbs out all the extremists, right? But I guess they conceded to that through their POI implicitly. The more important thing is, how do we actually get more discussions on our side? We get more discussions because now when we have a political system, when your electability is dependent on your political leadership, that means that the scrutiny for your political leadership is fundamentally changed. That means that you have radically more checks and balances from the public and from the media on each and every individual which gets put forth, right? Because we already have a political culture there, which is democratic to that extent that you have to basically put forth candidates which are checked, which might be of high quality and which might be high responsive to their constituents. We say that people have a rationale when they elect political parties and individuals to basically to connect individuals to their political parties, which means they have an active incentive when they are in Senate to do things which are in the interest of their constituents, right? Because then people might vote him out of the Congress. They might vote him out of the House of Representatives. We don't see comparatively what's the difference. You still have an active incentive because you yourself will not be re-elected in that same state, and your party will not actually put you forth for that state for the following primaries. We say that all things that primaries do is create partisanship, it creates radical rhetorics, and we don't have any benefits lost on our side because of these incentives. Before I wrap up my speech, I would like to get a POI.
What interest does the elitistic leadership of the Democratic Party have to have any Bernie Sanders who challenges it, who can vote against it?
Absolutely. First of all, because these ideas already exist in the public. Second of all, because obviously in his or her state, you have these ideas which are being supported. So this political party has an active incentive for these ideas and needs to be catered to. But the minority, and this point of them having like political and ethnic minorities out of the picture because of these elitism, is blatantly wrong, and it has changed for a while. Barack Obama wasn't necessarily the people's candidate, right? We flatly refused that Barack Obama wasn't the leadership candidate. He was one of the leadership candidates. But moreover, we say, you have Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio now, which are arguably one of the most important candidates of the Republican Party, which has recognized that it has to cater to the needs of the Latino population, which is something that in their world shouldn't have happened if they are so closed and if they are so comparatively disadvantaged. So here's what we say in the following. We have concrete harms from partisanship, which is concretely propelled by the primaries and all the incentives they have. We have heard no persuasive analysis on why the benefits that we have from our democracy will be substantially lost if we eliminate this level. We will still have a democracy, only a better one. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. I can call on the second speech of the opposition.
Okay?
So essentially, here's the case from the opening government. Trump, all the Tea Party people have came, they polluted the discourse, they have villained the other side, and at the end, the superdelegates are probably going to oust the most of them, so the damage is how we're going to pollute the discourse to the extent that bipartisanship is not going to be extended. This is the case at its hardest. Let's start with responding specifically to that. A, note, we give a challenge of what is actually unique to primaries. We get that A primaries, they have an abysmally low vote and turnout. Specifically, we have 4 other policies that are going to encourage more turnout. There are 4 even things as making it mandatory if necessary, and it's going to be more provided. There are 4 things as actually finding any other incentives of the people becoming more for vote. Secondly, by that logic, the entire vote between the Republicans and the Democrats also has an abysmally low vote and turnout. This is not a cause for revoking democracy as a whole. But like I said, they're going to be aggressive to one another in the primaries. We have no idea why it's not going to be happening, why they're going to have an election between the Democrats and the Republicans a couple of months after they're going to have a primary. The super PACs, the negotiations, the fact that they're not going to be able to work together, all are going to happen on their side of the house as well. Nothing is going to change. It's not unique. But the fact that it's going to say that more bipartisanship is going to be allowed. Note, none of our points were actually rebutted here. The fact that you're going to have a tyrant in the Senate, the fact that you're not going to have a representation for locals, the fact that you're going to have huge shady laws that are more likely to be passed. This is, even if you get more cooperation, so you're not sure A, why it's prioritized, and B, why it's actually called bipartisanship, if you're willing to be able to apply more pressure of lobbyism to people that are going to have a huge amount of power in order to take it. Moreover, he says, but people are now will have the incentive to also cater for people who are minorities. Note, not to the same extent on their side of the house. Hillary would have been preferable for the Democratic. After 8 years of Bush, if they would have put in a monkey, would have probably won the election. However, they didn't want to specifically put a monkey. What they wanted to do is to find something that the people have wanted to finance. By comparative, someone who actually got the money from the public. The public was ripe to actually elect specifically these individuals, much more likely to be chosen. Moreover, the damages that are going to solve regarding discourse solution. A, note, all of the things that are going to happen, as we point in the first picture, are likely to happen under the status quo that they want as well. What do we mean by that? In 2012, Trump was able to show and have the whole scandal of the birth certificate of Barack Obama regardless of being in a primary. Fox News is going to happen regardless of being in a primary. These people will have the capacity to run as independents as well for presidency in order to attract the same amount of attentions. Note, even if you accept the case to the fullest, they do not show us why the discourse which is already foul is now going to be corrected. This is not a motion that states that this House believes that 50 years to the back to the past we should have changed it. This is a motion that says that we should change it now. We have no idea how is it going to be corrected into the long term under their mechanism. Regarding the idea that fringe ideas are still going to exist, we completely agree with the idea that Ayn Rand is not going to be banned in the United States. Some people are going to cater for her. However, the idea that the people that are going to be elected are less likely to be specifically these people. Why is it bad? I'm going to tell you in a minute. But note, here is clearly a crucial point. The Tea Party, Trump, crazy people, government shutdowns, which are still likely to happen because of all of the reasons that we have given you in a second. Because if the idea already exists, if they are going to be likely to elect Tea Party people, shutdowns are going to happen on their side of the house as well. Right? Something has to change. The problem is not the candidate himself. The problem is that the fact is that 32% of Republicans believe that Obama is a Muslim even after all of that happened. The problem is becoming from something which is way more deeper into the United States. From the fact that no jobs, unfortunately, are actually available in manufacturing for a specific demographic that now has their lives being screwed over for a couple of generations. If you're a white American, comparatively to other groups in your society, you have evolved lesser to an extent if you're living in the Midwest. This is what is causing the fact that there is a need for that some people can cater for to these people, and this is what these people are using in order to inflate the discourse, right? The fact that minorities are stealing their jobs, quote unquote. The fact that you have to have crazy gun law rights in order to protect your house. Why does it matter? A, because you're not going to just suddenly disappear these issues by specifically saying that you're going to revoke primaries. In a second, and this is what I'm going to show you, all of the things are actually going to be words on their side, but I want 1 second's extension if they want to give it to me to engage. No, they don't. I'll give you a chance in a minute again. So let's say what is actually going to happen right now and what is going to change. Note, all of the crazy laws that have been able to do things as not giving an out for people who work in manufacturing, like not taking care of their social rights. All of the things things as having only 7 media conglomerates controlling the population of over 300 million people in the United States, without protection to the extent of these people are going to be worse on their side of the house. How come? Because if all you need is the fact that right now, instead of catering as a law for having a lot of people with balancing mechanisms, as microfinancing and making sure that you're going to have the people who do have another opinion in terms of actually just being against lobbyism to catering power for a specific group, you need to, in fact, of influencing 5 people who can now choose the entire party and concentrating all of the lines within the whip who can now elect people that they have, you know what, I want the POI from second first, then I'm going to continue. Second, okay, not again. So, yes.
Okay, do you think that parties have an inherent right to purge the fringe if it means they're going to be more successful and actually survive?
So the parties what?
Do you think that parties have the right to purge their fringes if it means that they will survive and succeed?
So we say that not necessarily, it depends to which extent, and we say that primaries, and even if this is what you're going to line, by the logic of your opening, they still have a lot of power influencing because they're still going to be able to oust some of the candidates, which is going to probably contradict them. Why does it matter? Because what is going to change? Look, even if we are going to get a representation of some of the opinions on their side of the house, and some things are still going to be catered for, the fact is, now I'm going to be more likely as the whip to try to elect someone who I know that I have information upon that I can use if I want to pass something that is going to be more helpful to my lobbies. Now I'm going to know that some people are just going to be easily more persuaded into my side. Now that I know that as the lobbying industry, I now need to influence 5 people without balancing mechanisms as super PACs that are trying to fight other super PACs or microfinancing in order to influence specifically them. Why does it matter? Because all of the crazy things, as even concentrating more the media conglomerates from 7 to 2 and less of hearing of opinions into the long term, if all of the crazy gun-like things that are going to pass are going to be way more likely. So if they want to talk about fringes, the root cause of what is actually creating the problem in the United States right now is going to be way more severe at its root specifically on that. So even if the parties have the right, this is a better mechanism to specifically enforce that. Making sure that right now there is another balancing mechanism in order to enforce specifically that. Notice as a crucial point at the end, if they're going to show us that primaries cannot by themselves be the balancer, we're perfectly fine with adding other mechanisms that are going to ensure that. We're just saying that primaries are a necessary thing in order to achieve that, in order to prevent concentrating lobbyism and more power specifically there. Thank you very much. Please oppose.
Thank you very much. That's great. The speaker will go.
So we believe that primaries are shows that are way too costly for parties. We believe that there's an incentive for parties to clean their slate, to reform, and that doesn't happen when you actually don't have the parties doing the selection of the candidates. Our extension is going to show you how it's useful and legitimate for parties to actually purge those fringes and to have internal selection mechanisms of how it's going to better their evolution, how it's going to better their image, and effectively going to do what they're supposed to do, is improve their electability. But before that, a few rebuttals. Let's talk about this point about more nuanced discourse existing in society. So also, at first we believe that there are 2 sides of this problem, right? So even if we agree with them that there is more nuanced discourse on, for example, the Democratic side with Bernie Sanders, we also have the other side, which we believe is much more harmful, and the harms there outweigh the benefits, whatever that Bernie Sanders brings to the table, of when you have GOP candidates talking about Muslims in the way that they do right now, or when you actually really don't have a debate on that side in general, because you have Ben Carson saying that pyramids were built for that or that purpose, which is just not true, and then Trump counterweighing that by just clamping down on Bush and offering nothing else but insults and not solutions. So we believe that there is a toxic debate that's going on that is allowed by primaries first. But we also don't believe that it's going to limit the good discourse that they want to achieve in society. We see that, first of all, it's not necessarily parties that drive the agenda that exists in society, but it is voters that drive the agenda that exists in society, and that's not going to change even without primaries. We still see movements like Black Lives Matter or movements like Occupy Wall Street that exist in society and that do actually augment the way parties view society, and you don't necessarily have to have primaries to make this discourse happen in this case. We also see that there's a lot of internal dialogue that's going on in parties. It's not just there's the king of the Republicans or the king of the Democrats that gets to decide Hillary Clinton's suitable and Bernie Sanders is not. What in reality happens, ladies and gentlemen, is that there are a lot of camps in each party that do have internal debates and do have a lot of these issues surface, regardless of whether you have primaries or not, but without the toxic elements that actually factor into the decision-making of those people. So we believe that this nuanced discourse doesn't happen, or even if it does, the benefits are highly mitigated. So the second thing about the democratization of it, like people need to know what they're electing and parties need to know what the preferences of the people are. So that effectively says that party systems like Canada, France, UK effectively are undemocratic because they don't know what happens within their voter base. And we believe that that's completely not true. We see that there are other ways to find out how, for example, social movements or polls that still are very reliable and quite accurate informants of party preferences and of what they need to pander to win the election. So we believe that's false. And the third thing that they brought to us is saying that, oh, now they're not going to be accountable to their constituents and they're going to be accountable to the party. So that's completely false. Because firstly, in the status quo, you are not accountable to the people that voted for you in the primary. A. B. You are accountable to the people that elected you in the first place in the actual election. So you're still going to have those people that you're going to be accountable to, your constituents, because you're still going to be elected by them, and you're not necessarily going to have to listen to every word of the whip. But in reality, what we see in the United States is still very highly polarized. So we still see that even with the primaries, we don't actually have that much of an independence for any lawmaker in the status quo, and that doesn't really make a difference. So we see that actually these benefits that they're claiming to have really don't exist. Let's talk about our extension of how it's useful and legitimate to give power to parties, to purge the fringes, to improve their chances at evolution. So, firstly, we see that primaries is a primary is a show of radicalization. So we always see this with every election cycle, that when a primary comes, you pander to the lowest common denominator, the most aggressive and the most radical fringes of your party, to get your votes, to get you elected, and then you slowly return to the center. So we see two problems with that. That happens because of what they said, of what OG said, is that there are low turnouts for primaries. And we want to qualify that with a claim as well, is that we believe that the people that are most interested in turning out for these primaries are the ones that are the most radical. So Tea Party voters otherwise wouldn't have that much legitimacy in the GOP because their camp is too small and the elites don't actually want to let them in to party governance. However, what they do is they skew the results of primaries to get their agenda out that isn't necessarily the actual agenda of the Republican voter base. So what you have is like people make false promises and people commit to this dialogue of toxicity and radicalness only to return to the center and actually forget the populations that they think will be saved by having primaries. So we see that as a problem. We also see that it destroys the image of the party, and there are actually very practical ways in which that is severely harmful. So we see when you allow people that are very incendiary, people like Trump, for example, to insult their way into the primary to become popular, to insult Bush, to insult even people like Megyn Kelly and Fox, what effectively you do is you limit your chances at cooperation within the party. Because what you need to have when you're actually a two-party system, and when you have the House, Senate, and presidency, you actually need all these institutional organs to work in accordance with each other. So what you actually need is you need to have cooperation, but that is effectively destroyed when you have the show of the primary where the ideal target for you is not even the Democratic Party as a Republican, but the other Republican candidate. It effectively denies your channels for further cooperation because it hampers the relationship in those parties so much that it is impossible to get back to. And we see a second problem, I'll take you in a second closing, is that you actually alienated a lot of voters. So like even if you have Rubio, for example, selected as the candidate, what is not going to happen is you're not going to regain the votes of those Hispanic voters, because what is going to be associated with you is the incendiary remarks that Trump has made for these people, and the Marco Rubio factor is not going to be redeeming enough. You have already lost those votes. Yes?
Incendiary discourse happens in the media like Fox News, all the time.
All right, sure. So even Fox News said that GOP needs to reform their stance on immigration. That like what is going on with Carson and what is going on with Trump, and even Jeb Bush, because this kind of discourse has been normalized simply because the primary exists. We believe that even the media, even the right-wing media, doesn't want that to happen because it's not useful for the party. So from a first-person perspective, this is horrible. We also believe that the integrity of the party and the way it's evolving is damaged in this case. We saw in 2012 that the Republican Party, for example, really needed to reform itself because it's losing the votes of the women, it's losing votes of minorities, and it hasn't done that just because the rise of Trump has been fueled by those few white men that they have been talking about because the primary results being skewed, is that we see that this agenda comes up that further pushes the GOP into the fringes, something that was against their agenda after they had lost, when Mitt Romney has lost. We also see it doesn't reward the politicians that actually care about the party. That's why you have anti-politicians, anti-establishment politicians like Donald Trump, who doesn't give a crap about the GOP entering the race and damaging their integrity. For all these reasons, we beg you to propose the motion.
Thank you very much for that speech. I call on the speakers in opposition.
Okay, can I start? Honorable Speaker, you see that the government side insists on talking about Donald Trump as somehow like the sole conversation that we can have on primaries. But we think that there are a lot of things that can fall on to what they say are fringes of parties. We think that there is a very large scope of this. We think in most cases fringes of political movements are quite relevant, should be included, and should be part of the democratic process. I'm going to speak about that more in my extension. But let's be clear about Donald Trump and incendiary discourse and the type of reactions that we had from Fox News. But firstly, let's just put it out there that Donald Trump would have existed anyway, right? He's a crazy billionaire that simply has enough money to fund his own campaign, be it as a Republican, be it as an independent, so he would be part of the political conversation. The specific difference is that when he's part of the primary in the Republican Party has the power to fight back, right? The Republican Party has the power to actually get Donald Trump not elected as the Republican representative. If, let's say, you would not have a primary process, and you would just have, like, Jeb Bush or whoever else, or Ted Cruz as a candidate, then you would still have Donald Trump in the main election. Donald Trump would still take away votes from the Republican base. The Republican Party would lose the election, similarly by losing votes from Donald Trump, but the problem is that discourse would happen in the main election, it would not happen within the primary, so you would lose out on the possibility to weed out what is relevant and what is not relevant for the Republican voter, right? So we think it's not just important that Fox News gets the point that the Republican Party needs to reform, but we think it's important that Republican voters get that point. And they only get that point when that discourse is being presented to them in the primary before the actual voting takes place. We think that because we have a conversation well before the voting between the Democrats and Republicans takes place, that gives Republicans the very important power to realize how useful voting works and how unuseful voting works. Not to mention that it shows them that there is a fringe of unacceptability. Not only that it shows them that some of the views that are actually shared by a lot of Republicans, like bigoted views against Muslims or bigoted views against immigrants, are now associated with more unacceptable things, right, even to the Republican base that Donald Trump does. We think that decredibilizes those positions, and I think that's a good thing, and it leads to reformation. Themselves, they've said on government side that, look, the fact that Donald Trump exists has actually meant that Fox News needs to tone it down and say, look, we probably need to look at reformation of our radical stances. It makes them become more moderate, it makes them come back to the center, it makes them turn into a more reasonable stakeholder. We think that's why even like really, really bad fringes like Donald Trump that unfortunately represent part of the Republican base need to be put out there in primary debates, because in these primaries, what they do manage to do is to normalize the other, to make the views that they associate with themselves less acceptable for mainstream politicians. Like, what we say is that we don't necessarily want politicians that know how to hide their bigoted views between like more politically acceptable discourse. We think it's fine we have someone like Donald Trump that comes out there and decredibilizes these views. Let's look on what we've had on the comparative. When we think we've heard this idea of like polluting discourse, we think that it's been thoroughly proven for opposition bench that the discourse can be polluted. Like within main elections, you can have attack acts between main elections. You can have radical views in main elections as well. You can have all of those negative things in main elections as well. We think moreover than that, we think phenomena like super PACs, like conglomerating special interests happens in main elections specifically. Moreover than that, the political establishment that they want to select candidates has to be on the comparative, right? They've been talking about all these awful things that are happening in primaries, but they've never really spoken to the fact that like political leadership is quite probable to promote some of these pernicious views as well, because they actually do gain votes, because they actually do radicalize, they actually do galvanize the base. The only difference is that politicians like are careful for like when they speak, what they speak, right? We've seen like even specific politicians, like in national elections, would go to a specific area in which you'd have more conservative voters. They would have a more radical discourse than the moment in which they would like speak at like a national convention. I think that type of like differentiation of these discourse doesn't only happen within primaries, but it happens within national elections. It happens within Europe. It happens within countries that don't have a primary process. Attack ads happen the same way, right? Let's talk about the United States. No, thank you. Okay, the United States, you have a first past the post like electoral system, right? We think it's crucial to understand that it has like a huge deficit of representation. We think like within a democracy, like all political groups should be represented. We think like radical socialists should be represented. Libertarians should be part of the political conversation. Not all political fringes are crazy Donald Trump, right? Some people have legitimate views that might be like more to the radical side of the spectrum. We think that these views are not likely to be well politically represented in the system. Why? Because in a first past the post system, you have a candidate that wins the most votes, even if it's like 32%, that gets into power. You don't have a candidate, like, you don't have an accumulation of majority, and you don't have a representation of the majority of those votes. We think, like, for instance, in places like France, it's quite different because you have like a two-tier voting system, and then you have like a conglomeration of votes to come together. Reason for which, for instance, in France, you don't have, like, you know, like the Front National just did not win the election, even though they came in first in a lot of the regions, right? But even more than that, what we see is that what party primaries do is that they actually include some of the people that are not like nationally elected, they're not locally electable. Specifically, like you see, Bernie Sanders is like a very, very fringe example of a socialist senator getting elected once in the history of the United States. But for most part, individuals like that are unlikely to like get national attention. Why? Because you need to have like representation across the country. Like people that actually support those types of policies, like maybe represent 10%, 12% of the United States, but they will never get in the national conversation because in their particular constituencies, they won't be able to garner most of the votes, right? We think primaries empower them to at least push the mainstream candidates a little bit in the direction that is part of what is needed, part of what is wanted, part of what is demanded by part of the population. Be that like tax reform, be that like more powers to labor union, more empowerment of workers. We think that that's why political primaries are exceptionally useful, not only to political parties, but to the political process itself, to the representation that people have access to within their voting. We think when you have candidates elected by political leadership, then people simply have a binary choice. They just choose the lesser evil. This way, they can at least be part of a campaign that they can actually identify with and choose the lesser evil that has at least been influenced by their authentic views and by the authentic representation of what they believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call upon the final speaker for the government.
Let's be entirely clear. The op bench rests on the assumption that voter preferences only change in response to preferences changing from within parties. We think that in many cases, it's actually the reverse. And that's important, because what we're dealing with in this debate are not equal and opposite problems and benefits from having fringe candidates included in primaries. The benefits of having Bernie Sanders included in the debate are not equal and opposite to the harms associated with having Trump within the debates. And we think that dealing with that comparative is what ultimately gives us the round on side closing government. Why? Because we've shown you that the harms far outweigh any benefits that we have from having Bernie Sanders involved, because we recognize that many of the issues that he is pushing the party to evolve towards happen in his absence. Why? Because parties all the time evolve in response to voter preferences changing, which we think actually evolve not solely because the politicians that represent them actually tell them that inequality is a problem, but rather, in many cases, is the opposite problem. More than that, we think that with the fundamental problem of the quasi-extension coming from opposing opposition is the current GOP rhetoric is not actually successfully galvanizing votes. We think there's actually a huge disconnect between the kind of rhetoric that many candidates that have previously been relatively moderate, like Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio, have had to adopt and are actually not what the majority of GOP voters actually believe in. We think that if that was true, it would be a very different debate, but the reality is that there's a huge disconnect currently between the debate that's happening in primaries and what voters actually want. Finally, we recognize and concede that the American voting system is not ideal. We think that the two-party voting system between the Democrats and GOP is not the best one in the world, but we think that we're dealing with this debate in that context. And so we're telling you the best possible outcomes that we can possibly craft in the context of having those incentives within that system. 2 questions to assess the outcomes of this round. Firstly, what is in the best interest of the country and democracy in general? And secondly, what is in the best interest of the parties? First question, what is in the best interest of the country and democracy? What we hear from open opposition is a peculiar case about how we need a plurality of points represented exclusively through the primaries, and that's only possible when you have Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul or Ron Paul involved in the primaries. No, thank you. They tell us that what this allows voters to do is input the strength of their preferences as well as have minority voices heard more. What they fail to engage with is the analysis that came down the government bench, which is that primaries are not representative of democratic preferences across the spectrum in the US. The reasons for this are twofold. Firstly, because groups like the Tea Party have a disproportionate reason to vote in those parties. Firstly, because they feel like persecuted in general and feel like they need to have their voices heard as far as possible, and often are the ones who are overrepresented in primary voting. But more than that, we think that primaries structurally make the dialogue far more extreme because it means that the inclusion of anybody, literally anybody who can meet the minimum requirements for entering the primary in the very first place, can push the dialogue in any direction. That's exactly what's happened with Trump. It's not that he aligns well with a particularly wide segment of GOP voters, but rather the fact that he was able to enter in the very first place was what caused that dialogue to shift. So it is a structure of the primaries in and of itself that actually causes the dialogue to shift far more to the right. What they tell us in response is that, well, the dialogue will still be more extreme because of the existence of entities like Fox News. That's simply not true. Post-2012, when the RNC published their report of the post-Mitt Romney loss, what they told us, and the public very explicitly, was that the GOP had to reform on one major issue, that being immigration reform. That is the reason why all of the super PAC money was going to Jeb Bush in the very first place. But the existence of Trump in the primaries allowed the debate to be shifted away from the recognition that that is what would allow the GOP to be successful in the 2016 election cycle towards bigoted rhetoric about Islamophobia and xenophobia. That doesn't actually represent a wide majority of opinions beyond the white uneducated males that are being polled currently on his issues. So we think that in that case, it's actually a structural problem that doesn't exist in the absence of primaries. And that's evidenced by people like Rupert Murdoch and people like Sean Hannity coming out and saying on air, we need immigration reform. So we think it's untrue that we have the extent of rhetoric on their side in the absence of primaries. And they haven't given us reasons why that would be the case. But more than that, we think that there's still reasons why there is diversity within parties. Like, this analysis presumes that no democracy ever without primaries could ever have dissenting opinions, that any parliamentary democracy, by virtue of the parties having and maintaining the right to elect their own leaders, would not have dissent, would not have debate, would not have opinions. We see that, like, pragmatically that's untrue, but it's untrue because we think that parties have to evolve in response to voter preferences. And we think there's actually good incentives, even in the US, for parties to still evolve along a plural axis of opinion. We think that people still have to elect a slate of people across various branches of the government, including the Senate, the House of Representatives, as well as the presidency. What this means is that there are invariably going to be people with different interests, but more than that, like, this rests on a characterization necessarily on their side of the house that, like, every single politician is necessarily power hungry and like a blood-sucking parasite. While we recognize that, like, many people are, we think that, like, the absolute reliance on their argumentation on that kind of characterization of the politicians is simply too broad, and we reject it. But more than that, we think that, like, by virtue of the size of the electorate in the US, it lends itself to plurality much more than smaller constituencies in the absence of primaries. No thank you. On closing, we hear that, like, Trump dialogue will still happen, right? But the consequence is that by having him associated and inside the GOP, it means that all the other GOP candidates have to push themselves further to the right. That's why all candidates, including Rubio, Bush, Kasich, and Chris Christie, all abandoned, I'll take you in a moment, relatively moderate stances on things like immigration as soon as Trump became explicitly a GOP candidate. That is only possible with the existence of the primaries. Yes, sir.
The Tea Party is not going to think bad. In your world, if they're still going to exist, they're more likely to be chosen for people who have favors to do.
No.
Implement the core problems that you yourself are opposing.
No, what we think is more likely is the fact that, like, the leadership in the GOP recognized in the aftermath of the 2012 election that what they needed to do was reform along the axis of immigration. We think that in the absence of primaries and the introduction of people like Ben Carson and Donald Trump, that would have gone along. Trump was like almost exclusively the reason why reform plans were like almost completely unraveled, and the reason why people like Jeb Bush were not able to successfully walk the line of actually reclaiming votes from Latino and women voters. Second question, what is in the best interest of the parties? We think that what we give you exclusively from our side is that one, parties have a right to do that which ensures two things. One, their survival, and two, their success. We think that primaries allow the inclusion of candidates like Trump, who are especially anti-establishment and anti-political to the extent that they actually threaten the existence and structure of the GOP in the very first place. As a party, we think that the GOP should have the ability to purge those people because it limits their ability to be cohesive and coherent as an institution. That's the reason why people like Rand Paul won't even come out and say that they would support the nomination of Donald Trump if he won the primaries. What we hear from them is like nominal and peripheral analysis about some benefits that we get about diversity that's repeated again and again. We've told you why it's negative for the party to have candidates associated with that rhetoric and be pushed, and by the time a general election comes along, it's too late to claw themselves back to a neutral position that will allow them to actually win an election in the actual, when the election actually comes. So because we think that it's actually better for democracy as well as the country, as well as we think that parties should retain the right to purge their fringes and are going to be far more successful in the absence of primaries, we are very proud of the players. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to call the final speaker for the opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the specific question in today's debate is, should we have primaries, having the process of candidates being selected with contribution from the population, or should they be directly assigned by party leaders? Now, this seems to be something that's often missed by proposition in the sense that so many of their arguments come down to something that is intrinsic to any electoral campaign, right? When they say things like the issue of pandering to white uneducated males in the process of securing your voter base is something that would happen in both systems. It is in no way shown as intrinsic to the primary process. Things like owing things to your sponsors that have financed you exists in both systems. It's in no way intrinsic to the primary mechanism. What you do change in terms of, then to speak of what opening had, they look at this concept of who you owe. And you owe your sponsors and don't want you owing your sponsors. First of all, you owe your sponsors in both systems, but the specific difference you're creating is that you owe your sponsors and you owe the party leadership that assigned you as a candidate. You owe the powerful people in your party in addition to your sponsors. We believe that this is a clear negative. We believe that all of the harms of the political system that currently exists come from candidates owing things to people, being dependent on people who help them get there. You're adding more people to a list of people who are responsible for getting that person there, and you would just create more debts to people like the whip, people like the leadership that are in turn in league typically with their own supporters, their own sponsors. So you just create more power give more power to the lobbies, because now lobbies have multiple ways to grasp at a candidate and have proper control through the whip, through their direct sponsorship, and you're just increasing the amount of influence. No, thank you. Now, the next thing they told us is that we have this process of radicalization, and that we have the fringes included in the conversation. That this is a polluting and toxic discussion in variance in both teams, and that this is a negative. Their underlying assumption, if that falls, all of their premises falls, and that we have a better conversation. Now, what we've looked at in closing is which system offers the better conversation. That's our direct metric. What has the most topics that need to be discussed. And now to this idea that having fringe topics included is a bad thing, and how that pans out and what that means, we say that having toxic subjects, those that we call toxic or polluting or whatever you want to qualify them as, just because we, as enlightened intellectuals that we are, don't like that conversation and think that conversation is a bad conversation, that's a good conversation to have. The fact that Islamophobia comes out through Trump, that we get to answer to it, that we get to show how irrational and illogical and negative it is, and that we get to respond to that, is something that is brilliant to have included in the conversation. Because you have to realize that what you're saying when you say just put in the party leadership candidate is that candidate is not less Islamophobic in any explicit. They're just more careful politicians, right? Because George Bush didn't come out candidate saying, I can't wait to be president so I can make some offshore place where I can torture Muslims until they say what I want them to say, right? That wasn't what he announced. Trump is just the person that is, open enough to say these things explicitly, and we're happy that that happens. We're happy that that conversation takes place, because it's not actually a specific difference. These people react to the people electing them, and some of the people electing them are Islamophobes that need to be included in the conversation so we can move past that and heal all those misconceptions and fix all those things. Furthermore, so when they say the fact that you have Donald Trump included in the conversation is not compensated by Bernie Sanders and the polls diversifying the conversation, is wrong to begin with. They're all positives, right? Donald Trump being included in the conversation with his vectoring of what people are saying in extreme setting and getting to answer that and to resolve those things that exist within the US population is a benefit itself. Not to mention, which what they basically concede, is that having Sanders or having the polls included in the conversation, which have more legitimate grievances about perspectives people can legitimately have on politics and issuing things that the mainstream wants to ignore and wants to keep in place, is already a benefit, and a massive one at that. We're saying that all of these conversations are great conversations to have. Your conversation is just more narrow, more limited to what the mainstream wants to be talking about. When you have one candidate of one leadership versus the other candidate of the other leadership, they will have essentially a fixed match in which they know what the topics they want to clash on, what topics they both agree they want to ignore. We're glad for widening the conversation and inviting all of these topics in that they would not like to talk about closing.
Okay, so the consequence of having Trump is barring refugees, more hate speech, more hate attacks, and literally...
Right. And I'm sure you don't like to hear that. I'm sure you don't like to hear that. I don't like to hear it either. Yet the fact that I would rather have these specific uneducated white males targeted discreetly by Jeb Bush with minor suggestions and then manifestations that are discreetly shoved into policy discreetly sometime in the third year is not something that I prefer. What I prefer is for people to actually bring out their candidates like Trump, and so I can directly address his issue with the way he puts it, with having a direct conversation. Again, it's a better conversation. It's not one you like, but it's one that needs to take place, because the fact that the Islamophobia doesn't come out in the elections because leadership would automatically put in good politicians that don't say explicitly Islamophobic things is not a positive. We're saying it's a positive that we have this inclusion of topics, and again, I know you want to keep talking just about Trump, but issues like Bernie Sanders looking at economic inequality and looking at waste in government that the polls bring up are essential things that none of the party favorites want to look at. At the end of the day, what would happen if we would have this system is that essentially, basically, someone like Jeb Bush, and not Jeb Bush himself, would have been assigned by party leadership as a Republican candidate. That's what happens in their worlds. He's the favorite. He's looking best in terms of getting sponsors. He's the one most in line with the party line that's willing to toe it. He gets assigned. In our world, he gets invalidated by the fact that he goes into primaries and people don't want to buy his establishment position. And we think that's a good thing. That's a benefit that you never addressed. The benefit comes directly from the fact that we have a wider conversation. And we believe that this metric of what gives us the wider conversation with more subjects, more topics, more challenges is a good thing. The fact that we have an election, even the election that is one Democrat versus one Republican, is stronger for the fact that we've had more issues included in conversation in the primaries that came before it, and that we have this better situation. They keep saying more coherent and cohesive. It's great. Yeah, of course it's coherent and cohesive if it's a single voice of a single organization made up of a few leaders causing an obedient lackey to be their candidate. But that is not true. That is not politically valuable. That's not democratically valuable. We want to have this conversation, especially in a two-party system in which the risk of the whole system being fixed by the two parties agreeing that we're only going to clash on these three subjects and the rest we can keep, pumping into, both of us will keep pumping into the military-industrial complex, both of us will keep pumping into the same areas of subsidies, is something that is essential. We need to have as much fringe as possible included. Yes, that includes Trump, but that's also a healing process to the rhetorics of a country we beg that you oppose.